Because again, we talked about Palmer Amaranth earlier. That dude can grow 2 inches a day in Kansas. Okay, so you go from a very effective application to a very ineffective application overnight. You know, if you're having to wait on the sprayer, wait on logistics, that kind of stuff. And weeds, by the way, don't stop growing when the wind is blowing or when the field is wet. So, you know, that really is one of the biggest challenges.
We're talking weed management strategies on the AgNow Roundup, which starts right now. Well, good morning and welcome to the AgNow Roundup. My name is Dave Deacon. It's been said that weeds are just a misplaced plant, but those misplaced plants can cause a lot of headache, money lost, and crop reduction anytime that they're in your field. That's why this week we're taking a look at weed management with Dr. Sarah Lancaster of Kansas State University, and we'll be talking with her in just a couple of minutes. But first, let's take a look at the weather around the ag world with meteorologist Matt Makins.
In this week's AgNow Weather Report, we have a lot of active weather coming our way, including severe thunderstorms, heavy rainfall. We're tapering off the snow in the States, but for the Canadian prairies, they have some snow on the way. And then we're going to be talking about a more active pattern later in April into May. That's all straight ahead in this week's AgNow Weather Report. Hope it finds you doing well. Matt Makins here. These are the significant changes that we've had to the drought over the last 4 weeks. I say significant, but there's been a significant improvement for southern Colorado, parts of New Mexico and Arizona, and throughout the corn country here up into the upper Midwest, where we've also seen some degradation. We've seen drought growth in south central and north central Oklahoma and Kansas. Out of the Boot Heel of Missouri, we've seen some drought growth. None of these changes have been overwhelmingly dramatic, but they are changes. What we're going to do over the next couple of weeks is try to take care of this drought growth area for not only Kansas and Oklahoma, but the Boot Heel of Missouri. We have some heavy rainfall coming in that way. So let's get to the hazards. What are we looking at for the next, say, 7 to 10 days or so? Well, we have wind events out to the west, around Colorado, the Rocky Mountain region of the Four Corners in New Mexico, also out into California, some high wind events there. Heavy snow and rain for parts of California. See this area, this green area? That's heavy rainfall. That's going to be the upper Midwest down through the Flint Hills and targeting that south central Kansas, north central Oklahoma region. That's going to be the 15th and 16th. Other areas of heavy rainfall, here's another one, kind of targeting the Mississippi, the Tennessee, and Ohio valleys. And that's going to be the 18th to the 20th. This blue region here, yes, as we see this heavy rainfall, there's going to be the risk of damaging thunderstorms too. We're entering that season, obviously, so we've got to keep our eye to the sky for hail and tornado and wind damage too. But it is water, and it's going to be quite a bit of it. Here is a look at the timeline. Let's go through the next week to 10 days. Big storm system exits as we go throughout this weekend. Now we're into Saturday the 13th and Sunday the 14th. Relatively quiet, but watch right in here as we get into Monday and Tuesday. You're going to see storms popping up. A lot more shower activity develops in this area Monday into Tuesday, and that's going to be growing potential for those severe thunderstorms and that heavy rainfall. There's kind of the initial push of some of the storminess into Tuesday, and watch as this area just gets much more active from Monday, Tuesday into Wednesday, and we'll near Thursday now on that timeline, and there's that storm system as it develops. You just watched it develop there. The center of it's going to be over the upper Midwest, but it's going to send this trail, this tail, if you will, of severe weather and heavy thunderstorms down to the south. That is the storm system producing those areas of significant precipitation I highlighted in that previous map. So we have a lot of activity to come through. What does this mean bottom line? What is my rain gauge going to pick up? So total precip favors a lot of the eastern half of the country. Also California, parts of the Rockies, but you can see how dry the Four Corners region is. Let's fly down into this bullseye right in here. So again, kind of the drought growth area was right in here or so. Going to get water. Most of that water is, however, going to be just off to the east. But here we have the Osage country. We're getting down close to Dallas. So let's just say Dallas to Oklahoma City and east all the way toward the Mississippi. We're looking at rainfall totals of 2.5 to 3, perhaps a little bit more with some of the stronger thunderstorms. Quite a bullseye of rainfall there. Great for stock water, great for soil moisture, great for the prairies as they start to green up. Get that water in into that grass. Here in the upper Midwest, we also have some heavy precip. So here we have sections of Minnesota, then into Wisconsin, northern Illinois, northern Indiana, out toward the Ohio Valley. And we also see these bullseyes of 1.5 inches, 1.75 to 2, 2.5, and perhaps some 3s with some heavier thunderstorm activity. So it's a lot of water to come through a couple of crop critical areas and some critical forage areas too. Snow on the way, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Yeah, we have some snow for the northern states. It's really confined to the Rockies though, and the high plains, but we're shifting that snow up into the Canadian prairies. What a blessing that will be as they get ready to plant, start growing, get forages, their dugouts. There's going to be some heavy snowfall there across the Canadian prairies. Take a look at soil temperatures for a moment. I'm using 4-inch depth of the sensors for these soil temperatures. You see the sites located here. What this has changed over the last 2-3 weeks since the last time I showed you this map is how much warmer the soil is getting. It's thawing. The vast majority of these dots are now into the light reds, into the deeper reds, and that's indicative of just warming soils, thawing out if they had been frozen. And what does this tell us? Our soil is now getting ready. It's warm enough. It's going to absorb a lot of that water coming down. Even parts of the Canadian prairies where the soil is not firm, it's close to freezing, but it's going to still hold on to a lot of that water. So we've entered now into those spring months where the soil is healthier in terms of picking up and soaking in as much water as is possible. So that's a good way to see a rainy period, or in some cases snowy, as we head into these spring months, being able to hold on to that water in our ground. Let's go beyond that over the near term, and let's go for the next 4 weeks. So here's week number 1, 2, 3, and 4. Week number 4 is stretching out into the first week of May. And what I see is the heavy precip for next week that we've chatted about. The following week, it'll focus on Texas, the southern Mississippi, kind of the Gulf Coast states. A little bit quieter for the last week of April. As we get into early May, moisture stretches from Mexico through Texas back into the Central Plains. And what I see now is a pattern for May that's very favorable for water in the south central states. So southern plains, central plains, moving out into the high plains, into the Rockies. Good water signal is showing up for May. We'll chat more on that on future videos. That's this week's AgNow Weather Report. Matt Nakins here. Blessings to you and yours.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. Now, the rain that he's talking about does help the crops grow, but it also helps the weeds grow. And that's why weed management is such an essential part to any crop development. And that's why this week we're talking with Dr. Sarah Lancaster with Kansas State University. And Dr. Lancaster, talk about your weed program that you have at K-State.
So in my role as an extension specialist in Kansas, I get to work with all agronomic crops all across the state, which means there is some variety in the types of weeds that we look at from cropping system to cropping system. But by and large, the number one weed that I spend time talking about and working on is Palmer Amaranth. So for our friends to the east, it's kind of the bigger, badder cousin to water hemp. And that it's really competitive, it grows really fast, it has a lot of genetic diversity, which lends itself to a lot of herbicide resistance. And so that is across the state the number one weed problem that we have.
Well, that's pretty remarkable for a state like Kansas, and we see a lot of pigweed, as it's commonly referred to, in the broadleaf crops. Do we see that in maybe a grass crop as well?
We do. I mean, even in, for example, corn, it would be one of our top weeds, assuming that you're in a glyphosate resistant crop and you're easily able to control your grasses. Definitely. Pigweeds are going to be your number one problem, even in wheat. So the last couple of years, the wheat crop in Kansas has had a little bit of a rough start and has had kind of a thin canopy. And the Palmer is there hanging out underneath that canopy in any amount of light, especially as the crop starts to dry down towards harvest. We've talked a lot about pre-harvest applications just to allow combines to get through some of the pigweed messes that we have. And then, the third grass crop that's kind of unique to our states of Kansas and Oklahoma would be milo or grain sorghum. And we definitely have challenges in order to stay on top of Palmer Amaranth and grain sorghum.
There are a number of ways to control the weeds, but let's really dive into how row spacing can actually, and canopy development can actually impact weed growth throughout the season.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, I mentioned herbicide resistance when I was talking about Palmer Amaranth, and really that has driven a lot of kind of renewed interest in some of the non-chemical weed management strategies for weeds like Palmer Amaranth. And so row spacing, plant population, definitely factors in that conversation. So the theory there, the principle would be that the quicker we can get canopy closure, so the quicker we can stop light from hitting the soil, the fewer weeds we're going to have germinate. And if they've already germinated, they're not going to grow as much. So that's the basic premise behind it. Where it starts to get really interesting, though, from my perspective, is thinking about, okay, we know we have weeds down there because they already germinated before the canopy closed.
Right.
So now we want to go through maybe and try to put on a residual herbicide, right? So as we think about what is the best timing for making that layered residual herbicide application in terms of canopy closure, not a question that there's a ton of data in the literature to answer well. Other things that we think about in our part of the world, right? We live in these states where we have this rainfall gradient from east to west. And definitely, that comes into play in terms of what is the trade-off between weed control and yield, right? Because that intra-specific competition sometimes can be greater and more detrimental to the crop than the inter-specific competition between the crop and the weed.
Kind of want to go back to what you were talking about a little bit earlier. You do want to go into a cropping season, with a clean, weed-free ground. Let's talk about building that strategy whenever it does come to going into that crop.
Yeah, so I like the word you used there, strategy, right? And I think the other thing to think about is that it really ideally, I know that we don't live in a perfect world, but if we did, we would be thinking about multi-year strategies, right? And thinking about that rotation kind of all one whole trip through the rotation, right? Not just one crop at a time. But alas, economics, weather, Trump weed science. So as we think about herbicide strategies, yes, the kind of bumper sticker would be start clean, stay clean, right? And so again, in the states that we live in, no-till or reduced-till is really important, right? So we're putting a lot of emphasis on those herbicide programs, even fall or very early spring. Here in Kansas, one of the weeds that we struggle with in the western parts of the state is kochia. And so what we found is those very early spring applications are really important for getting good kochia control. So thinking about that fall, early spring application with contact herbicides as well as residual herbicides to get us through to planting.
Should a producer look at herbicide or steel whenever it comes to controlling weeds?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I sometimes say that till for some of my farmers is literally and figuratively a 4-letter word, right? But from where I stand, anytime you completely rule out an option for whatever you're doing, you kind of maybe are going a little too far extreme, right? I mean, obviously, no-till, reduced-till has tremendous advantages in our states in particular, but all across the country. Here we talk a lot about water retention, moisture retention, keeping that soil in place, all of those things. But we have some weeds here in Kansas, and you guys have them in Oklahoma too. Tumble windmill grass is one of them. Yeah, so, tillage really right now is about the best recommendation we have to keep that weed under control, just because glyphosate doesn't work on it very well. The typical grass herbicides don't work on it very well. The other thing to think about is that I mentioned Palmer Amaranth and kochia, water hemp. Those weeds are all real small, right? So they have to be close to the surface of the soil to germinate. If we do back up, tumble windmill grass, we like kind of what I would consider a light tillage. We talk a lot about sweet plows and things like that. So we're not turning the soil. If we start to turn the soil a little bit and get some of those seeds buried, then we can kind of hit a reset button a little bit on the active weed seed bank that we have to manage in any given year. Now, if you do that every year, you get on this treadmill where you just return last year's seeds to the top of the surface. But if you're going to let's say you're a new guy who's just purchased a farm and the last land manager was not very proactive about weed management, then you could potentially kind of reset your switch with some tillage to bury some of those weed seeds and keep them from germinating and becoming a problem. So it's no one way is completely right or wrong, right? This is a science, not a religion. So we kind of need to think about, when do we use it? How do we use it? Instead of just saying, I'm not going to use it.
Producers really do have those backgrounds of we use still every year, or we're nothing but herbicide. But there really is a balance whenever it comes to that strategy that we talked about there.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that really kind of changed my thinking on this was some research that was done at Hayes in central Kansas here. And they were focusing on looking at some of the soil health qualities following a minimal tillage event, so running sweep plows. And statistically, really not enough difference to worry about in terms of the soil health properties after one tillage event. Now, again, if you're doing this every year, that's a different story. But occasional tillage, done occasionally, can be a useful tool.
I think we can all agree that the wind is one of the major reasons why people move to the Great Plains, especially Kansas. And how does the wind actually impact controlling the weeds in Kansas?
So number one, it affects the number of days we have that are suitable for spraying. Right. So that is, if you talk to the custom applicators, honestly, that's probably one of their, other than finding bodies that want to sit in the sprayer seat, that's one of the biggest challenges that they have, is just the number of days that are suitable for spraying. Goodness, in my research program, right, that's a big challenge, just trying to hit those days that are suitable for spraying. So that means we rely on those residual herbicides, or, maybe a cover crop, something like that, anything denser canopy, denser row spacing, anything we can do to slow down the weeds and give us a wider window where we can get an effective application, right? Because again, we talked about Palmer Amaranth earlier. That dude can grow 2 inches a day in Kansas, okay? So you go from a very effective application to a very ineffective application overnight, if you're having to wait on the sprayer, wait on logistics, that kind of stuff. And weeds, by the way, don't stop growing when the wind is blowing or when the field is wet. So, that really is one of the biggest challenges. And then the other thing that comes up about this time every year, we have fields, particularly in the western, let's say half of our state, that are maybe in corn stalks right now, or milo stalks, or wheat stubble, or we have wheat that maybe got seeded late, and so it's not, tiller, not filled out real well, not real big, and we've been dry. And then we get 50-mile-an-hour winds. And I don't know if you paid attention, but they closed I-70 over the weekend because of the dust.
Wow.
The dust storms.
Wow.
So it always feels sort of like apocalyptic to me when they start talking about shutting the interstate. But they shut down the interstate because of the dust. So I look at that, I look at the field that it came from, and I wonder, what management practices had been done on that field in terms of herbicide applications. Because we know that all of our herbicides, as soon as they hit the ground, there's some level of interaction between that herbicide and the different little particles, or and the soil particles, okay? And so as that herbicide is attached to that soil particle, wherever that soil particle goes, so goes the herbicide. Right. And so, what we don't have a good answer for is, at what point do I need to respray my field? Have I completely invalidated my herbicide application, that kind of thing? And honestly, a lot of the work in the literature on this topic is more from the perspective of, where does the dust land and what is the impact of the herbicide there? But it's still a real concern. Maybe not the biggest concern under those conditions, but it is something that can happen, and maybe needs to be taken into account in the next phase of your weed management strategy.
One thing that you said that really, stuck in my mind is that you mentioned that it attaches to the soil particle. Are there different approaches and strategies to having having it blanket the floor, the soil, but then also have it attached to the leaf and then actually kill the plant?
Yeah, so a couple of ways to answer that question, Dave. Number one, thinking about contact herbicides versus residual herbicides, right? So a product like glyphosate or Liberty, those products need to be taken into the plant, and then they move through the plant and they get into the cells and they kill the cells and kill the plant. Other herbicides, so these would be things like Dual, Zidua, flumioxazin and atrazine, Valor and atrazine are examples of herbicides that are both residual and contact. But plants then take those up either through the roots or through the seedlings as they germinate. And so that is, one of those differences in strategies is thinking about those residual herbicides to keep the weed seeds from germinating. So that would be our duals and our Ziduas, or a contact herbicide that has to come in through the leaf and get translocated. So the second way to think about that or approach that then would be thinking about, am I going to just do a broadcast application or an incorporated application? So I got a question along those lines earlier this week of, okay, so do I spray before my drill or do I spray after my drill, right? And so I'm old enough that I remember my dad spraying Prowl right in front of the cultivator, right? So that's one thing, right? When we're trying to get that herbicide in so we don't lose it to volatility to the atmosphere in that case. But the herbicides that I mentioned and the herbicides that we're relying on to do kind of the heavy lifting in our pre-emergence programs today, really there's more benefit of keeping them in that solid blanket or that solid layer near the surface of the soil than to incorporate them. So, if somebody asks me spray before or spray after the planter, obviously the practical answer is whenever you can get it sprayed, right? But in an ideal world, we would like to see the sprayer chasing the planter rather than the other way around. That gets a little risky when you start getting into, it might rain this weekend, right? You don't want to get so far ahead that your weeds are up and 6 inches tall before your sprayer gets there. So yeah, I like to kind of tongue in cheek. Logistics is going to trump agronomics or weed science every time, right? You got to keep those logistics in line.
And one of the great things about doing the AgNow Roundup, I get to talk with land grant folks from all around the country about what they're doing now with their research and then what they're doing in the future. What are you doing looking at weeds in Kansas?
Yeah, so basically, this is a generic answer, but anything that we can do to optimize, especially those residual herbicide applications. So one of the studies that was recently completed that I was actually just a piece of, the lead scientist was in Wisconsin, but I think it's one of the most interesting things that I've done here at K-State, and that is we were looking at answering the question of what happens to residual herbicides when we apply them in a cover crop termination herbicide application. Right? Because it's kind of the same question that I mentioned when you asked about row spacing, right? We know that for a residual herbicide to be effective, it has to get to the soil. But there are a lot of things that herbicide droplet comes in contact with before it actually gets to the soil. So whether that's a soybean leaf or whether that's a cereal rye leaf, it's still going to reduce the amount of herbicide that hits the soil. And so just trying to figure out how all those things interact to improve our herbicide applications. Another direction that we're starting to look at that I'm excited about is this summer I'm partnering with a local co-op here and just looking at the integration of drones for scouting and targeted spraying applications. And so just trying to give that some foundation for what guys are doing in the field, because these are real right here. It's easy for me to sit in my office and say theoretically, but the guys at the co-ops are trying to figure out how to make this cash flow and how to make it work well for their customers. So it's exciting to get to do stuff with guys that are firmly planted in the real world instead of me kind of making sure I keep a few toes in it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Lancaster with Kansas State University, for going on with us and helping us work through the weeds across Kansas, but then also across the Great Plains, because when it comes down to it, and I've heard it 100 times, weeds are just misplaced plants. And thank you for helping us really select for the plants that we really do want. Thank you for going on with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, and of course, thank you for watching this episode of the AgNow Roundup. If there's something on the show that you'd like to learn more about, say weed management strategies, head over to our website, our redesigned website, agnowtv.com. And while you're there, you can find fact sheets from all of the land-grant universities that we've worked with over the time. And of course, you can check out our social media, sign up for our weekly email, but then also you can download the AgNow TV app, all at agnowtv.com. So check it out. From our farm to your farm, we're rooted in research and proven for producers. I'm Dave Deacon for AgNow.